This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 476, off the cuff number 10. On today's show, we're talking about some things that have been on our mind, including the DOJ accessibility ruling, Drupal CMS event recipes, and tooling for core development, to name a few. We'll also cover Font Your Face as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today, our guests are our hosts. And to start off, I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM. And joining me today, Josh Mitchell, Founder and Principal Consultant at M6L. Hello, Josh.
Hello, hello.
Joining us for the whole show this week, Martin Anderson Klutz, a Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia.
Hey, everyone.
Sorry, Martin, I'm just smiling at the way that I bolded your name in the show notes, because if I were to read it, joining us today would be Martin Anderson, a Klutz Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia, which is interesting. But anyway. Also, last but certainly not least, Nick Laughlin, founder of Enlightened Development.
Happy to be here.
Okay, Martin, before we jump into all of the things today, can you tell us about our module of the week, which is Font Your Face?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to add and manage web fonts for your Drupal site directly within the admin interface? There's a module for that. It's called Font Your Face, and it was created in May 2010 by Scott Raynon, but the most recent release was by Enrique Mendez of CINT. It has 7.x-2.8 and 4.0.0 versions available, the latter of which supports Drupal 9.4 and 10. It is actively maintained, has test coverage and security coverage, and there is some documentation, but it looks like it might be ready for a refresh. In terms of open issues, there are 48 open issues, 8 of which are bugs against the current branch, which is quite good considering the module is in use by 32,213 sites according to Drupal.org. The module provides an interface to browse fonts from Google, Adobe, Typekit, and more. It will show license restrictions for fonts where there are some considerations from a legal standpoint. And when you find a font you want to use, you just click Enable. You don't need to write any CSS or define a library. It's easy to mix and match fonts from different providers. It can even make it easier to include your own local fonts. The module also includes submodules for the different font providers, so you enable the submodules based on where you want to use fonts from. Then you can import the fonts for those providers, though you do need an API key to import fonts from Google. The module does also have an API, so you can write your own modules to integrate with other font providers or access the information about available fonts in other projects. So let's talk about Font Your Face.
It's unnecessarily aggressive, but if you think about it, fonts are really just like right in your face all the time on the web.
I actually haven't used this module that much recently. I remember I used to use it all the time because it made integrating modules so much easier. But I think one of the concerns, over time has become with performance, pulling modules in from other domains. So most clients want to, they want a smaller set of, I should say, a more curated set of fonts, and they want them to be served from their own domain. That solves a lot of other issues as well with like CSP and all that kind of stuff. So I haven't used this personally in quite some time, but now that you've brought it up, I might use it on a project because I think one of the things that it might do is make it easy to switch back and forth and test a bunch of different things. And then once you kind of settle on what fonts you want to use, you can, you can import them the way that you normally would now.
So admittedly, I've not used this module in forever, but I'm wondering. It sounds like, and what I remember from it, I think it does. But this kind of falls into that like ecosystem of modules. That's kind of like a supporter module, right? So like I think of like search API as like that type of module where you can kind of like install it and then install a sub module to connect to, you know, a service that you're looking to bring in, right? And it just kind of makes that whole process a lot easier. Which I mean, I think is nice. I think it's nice to have modules like this in Drupal, and like I kind of appreciate what this module is doing, because sometimes integrating with font services or bringing fonts into your website can be just kind of annoying. So it sounds like this is definitely simplifying it.
I was actually surprised to see the total number of installs. That seems kind of high for like kind of where the ecosystem is at. I mean, it's a third of those installs seem to be, you know, modern Drupal. So that's kind of interesting to see that it's popular in that
Oh
space.
man, it's funny because I was going to say, like, it would be interesting to see how many of those are Drupal 7 versus Drupal 10, and you just did it
Yeah,
for me. There we
it's
go.
about 1/3 to 2/3. 2/3 Drupal 7, pretty much, and a couple Drupal 6s. I always feel bad for those folks.
To your point, Nick, earlier about serving the fonts locally, I mean, one of the submodules is for local fonts. So the module could still be useful even for people who still want to serve the fonts locally, but don't want to go through, you know, writing the CSS markup, defining a library, you know, those things as well.
Fair enough.
Very useful. Well, Martin, thank you for bringing us another enlightening, in your face module of the week. If folks wanted to suggest a module or just get in touch to chat about modules or anything else for that matter, how would they go about doing that?
We're always happy to chat about modules in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Great, thanks. All right, before we get into our plethora of primary topics, let's hand it over to Mike Anello to tell us a little bit more about Florida Drupal Camp.
Hey now, this is Mike Anello, aka Ultimike from Drupal Easy, and I am indeed interrupting the wonderful Talking Drupal podcast to tell you about Florida Drupal Camp. In case you haven't heard, this is the best Drupal event anywhere, not that I'm biased, and we would love for you to join us from February 21st to 23rd for 3 days of pure Drupal goodness. Yes, we'll have a ton of Drupal sessions, and yes, we'll have some amazing low-cost training workshops, and yes, we'll have our famous, amazing taco lunch. And as if that wasn't enough, we've got a stellar lineup of featured speakers, including Lorei Timoney, the product manager for Experience Builder, Martin Anderson Klutz, one of the Drupal CMS track leads and hopefully familiar to Talking Drupal listeners, and Kat Shaw, a certified web accessibility specialist. So point your web browser to fldrupal.camp and register for the event. And if you've got something to say, submit a session proposal as well. We look forward to seeing you, and now back to the fine folks at Talking Drupal.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And, you know, Florida in February is lovely for anybody that's trying to get out of the snow or just change of scenery. So definitely check it out. All right, let's jump in here. You know, we're pulling off the top of the pile here, and I think Josh, you wanted to talk about the DOJ or Department of Justice accessibility ruling. What is that, and how might it impact our listeners?
Yeah, you bet. Well, I'm actually surprised that it hasn't come up as a topic yet, because I feel it's like one of those areas. Drupal does accessibility really well. A lot of government sites use Drupal. And there are a lot of government sites that haven't done accessibility audits. So you get this combination of things with the Department of Justice ruling for this United States Department of Justice. They came down with an accessibility ruling on April, I believe, 26th of this year. That basically says that depending on the size of the jurisdiction, you have blank amount of time to get everything on your site that is publicly facing up to the WCAG 2.1 standard. I don't know why they didn't do 2.2, but they did 2.1 AA. Which, I mean, for those of us who've done accessibility projects before, that's not a simple task to get everything up to that level. And the size of the jurisdiction makes a big difference here. Smaller jurisdictions have a longer amount of time; they have until like 2027. But if you're a larger jurisdiction, and I think the number cuts off at something like 50,000, community members or something like that, you basically only have until 2026, April, to try to get all of that front-facing stuff up to date. There's some exceptions, and we can talk through those if you're interested.
So for a legal dum dum like myself, when you say jurisdiction, do you mean city and town, or do you mean city, town, organization, group of people, sort of thing?
It's actually kind of fascinating, the different breakdowns. When you look at the ruling and you look at organization size, what does that kind of represent? It can be everything from what you just described: the city, town, county. It could be, if it's a kind of a multi-county thing or a regional sort of government body, that falls into that, and they have to figure out the calculations for there.
Mhm.
It also applies, interestingly enough, to educational institutions that are, funded by the government. So if you're looking
Right.
at state schools and you're looking at, local school districts and everything else, I mean, it is a huge ruling in terms of what it impacts and just the total scope of it.
So my question then is, is it restricted to .gov, or if a town just happens to have like a .org domain, are they still covered by this? I would imagine so.
Yeah, they're still covered. It is the institution itself, whatever that incorporated institution is, and kind of representing that area that they serve, however big that area is. But it's massive.
Interestingly, Stephen is asking in the chat why this doesn't apply to commercial sites, and whether this is like the first step to getting to that kind of like overarching, like, hey guys, guess what? You got to do the right thing. This is typically how things start, I would imagine, is with the government saying, hey, we're going to do the right thing for us, our stuff, and then hopefully commercial sites follow along. But what's your take on it, Josh?
It's kind of interesting. I think in some ways, government institutions have been a little bit shielded from some of the requirements based on, oh, it's too hard for governments to do this with the money that they have. While commercial enterprises actually have been sued. I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't that long ago that Target got hit with a huge lawsuit for
Domino's,
accessibility.
I think there was a Domino's
Yeah.
employee too.
So there's, from a commercial standpoint, if you're a big enough target, the legal risk is still there. So they still have an impetus to try to be as accessible as possible, and to have alternate ways of access if they can't get it to fully accessible. But the DOJ ruling was really just kind of a, hey, we should be doing better with government services. Their community members. This is the one thing that people can't live without. Could you live without Domino's or Target? Probably. But you got to pay your property taxes. You've got to access, animal services to get your pet licensed. That whole kind of range of things.
Have you? I had to go and print my deed the other day.
Oh, assessment and taxation systems are some of the worst. I mean, like,
yeah.
I don't know. Have you ever looked at the system that they typically use for like plot maps and like, understanding where you're.
That's assessments and taxes too. Same GIS.
Yeah.
It's all rolled in.
Yeah.
That is some of the worst online. To be fair, they were also some of the first things I think the government put online.
Yeah,
but they haven't updated them since
impact.
1995.
So just going back to the original question about the commercial aspect of this, right? And we did talk about, like, the companies out there that have been sued, right? Because their systems were not accessible, whether to the public or to employees, right? Do you think, like, so the reason that a lot of people in the commercial space are, concerned or worried about this is because they don't want to get sued. They don't want to get, they don't want to get that letter in the mail, right? do you think that there are groups out there or people out there that like, kind of send these letters to try to shake the tree to see if any money falls out of it for commercial entities? Do you think like that's probably not happening as much with the government, right? Like people aren't like, hey, I'm going to send my local town a letter that says you're going to make your site accessible or I'm going to sue you, right?
It happens more than you'd think.
Really
It
interesting.
really it's about having someone in the community who takes it as a, hey, we need to change something. And then they bring the lawsuit, and then of course that goes into, whoever the counsel is for that entity has to
Yeah.
kind of go back and forth on it and figure out things. So much of that gets settled that we don't see it. So that's a, kind of a drag on government there's these settlements that have to occur. But it does happen. I mean, there was this isn't web related, but like City of Portland had a massive lawsuit related to accessible sidewalks. And so now you can't really go more than about 10 blocks without running across a construction project where they're putting in the accessible ramps to just about every intersection in the city. And it all came out of a lawsuit that's like, hey, this is where the money needs to go, make everything accessible. So I think that same thing is going to happen in this kind of tech space as well over time.
And I think the important piece here too is like to your earlier question, John, is the government kind of exempted itself from a lot of these rules in the beginning. And that's the way it typically goes. Like, yeah, we're going to set this rule. It's really hard for us to implement this, so we're not going to. We're going to make ourselves not liable for it, at least for now.
Yeah.
And that's why this is such a landmark kind of decision, because now, now it's not just a guidance that they have to do it. Now legally they have to. So, a lot of the websites that were kind of trailing or just like doing a review now have a mandate to do it.
I think Drupal also sets itself apart a little bit, not only in the degree to which there's a focus on sort of the front end experience being accessible, but also the back end experience as well being accessible. So even something like Layout Builder, there was significant effort put into it to make sure that it is keyboard navigable so that people using assistive technologies can still create pages in the same ways.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, obviously we love Drupal here, and Drupal is very accessible. So Josh, to kind of put a pin in this for a bit, I'm wondering how long. So this came out in April. How long do you think it's going to take before, I don't know, let's say 50% of the government websites out there are fully, I think you said 2.1 AA. Is that what you said?
Yeah. So it's 2.1 AA. I think some websites are already working towards it.
Yeah.
I think the blind spot for a lot of those organizations, they're working on, like, say, their public website.
Yeah.
But they're not thinking about all the third-party tools that they use software as a service or managed services to provide. So things like your council document search or the assessment taxation systems we were just talking about, mapping systems.
Mhm.
One of the worst, and I don't think this will get you sued, but like GovQA sells this idea that you can submit a records request and you get back records requests. Every implementation I've seen of it, I've never seen one that comes even close to being keyboard navigable. And most of the time, they don't even have a good mobile interface because they were built, for the most part, back in the early 2000s before we were making those considerations, and they've never been updated. They go years and years with nothing more than a city seal on it or a county seal or whatever it is. And those types of pieces of software are still covered under this. There are some exceptions for older documents. So if it wasn't published by the deadline, if it's a PDF and it's been kind of like thrown up on a website, they're not actually requiring remediation on that. They're like, okay, that's archival. We're just not going to deal with it. But if it's something that is going forward from that point, publicly accessible, that the community would interact with, it's definitely covered. I actually don't think most organizations are going to hit it by the timeline because, at least in my experience, the percentage of those organizations doing the audits right now on their third-party software is very low. Yeah. So it's something to, hopefully over the next year, you'll see this just huge burst of accessibility audits and testing and the resulting projects that come out of that to try to address them.
Well, I mean, that's a problem too. As just a final point, is a lot of people don't realize, they don't think about PDFs as needing to be accessible. They think like, oh, it's just a print document. Like you can open it, you can look at it, that's fine.
Yeah.
And they don't realize the amount of work that has to go into making a Word or Excel or PDF accessible. And I mean, in a lot of cases, it can be easier just to move that to the web into a system that makes it accessible. And then, you don't have a PDF. It's just a lot. Maybe there's a PDF print, like you can a print option or something, but the accessible version is just in the web. And then that makes it easier to index it. I mean, there's a lot of other benefits.
I feel like that's probably Adobe's problem.
No,
I'm kidding.
no.
I'm kidding.
Adobe has
but
in this case, actually, Adobe has the tools to make them accessible. It just takes a lot of work and expertise.
I
to
think
make
it's
PDFs
editors.
accessible.
Editors are going to edit, right? They for the most part, especially if they've been, working in a job for 10, 15, 20 years, they think of things as, I need to create a document. I need to create something that is visual, something that is going to impress the people that I'm delivering this to, whether that's to my manager or to a group of stakeholders, a group of community members, whatever. They want it to look good. And so they very much think from a print standpoint and not from a digitally, how would I navigate this standpoint. So it actually, in my opinion, it starts with the Office suite, right? And it doesn't matter if it's, Google Workspaces or Office 365 or what have you. It's that, do I have accessible headings and everything else? It's hard to create an accessible PDF. I mean, you could do a whole episode actually on just creating accessible PDFs. I think it's pretty, not that it's a Drupal topic.
No, but I feel like that's like a triple episode.
Easily.
Yeah. And to clarify, my comment was more around the fact that most people think that like Adobe is the creator of all things PDF, not that not that they're any way responsible for making your PDFs accessible. All right, let's shift gears to the new hotness. Used to be called Starshot. Now we're calling it Drupal CMS. But more specifically, Martin, Drupal CMS event recipe. What's going on there?
So as listeners may know, I was named the track lead for the events recipe back in the summer and have been doing my best to coordinate efforts there to really bring that along. I was fortunate that I already had something that was very similar to a recipe and had actually been working with Jim Birch and one of his colleagues over at Canopy around getting converted to a recipe. So from that standpoint, there was some significant pieces that were already ready to kind of drop into Starshot. But since then, have been working on sort of building out that ecosystem a little wider. So in addition to what's already in Drupal CMS, which is the ability to create an event, be able to associate it with a location, there is an events calendar recipe. And then there is an events registration recipe. And actually, one of the newer elements that I created just in the past month was an events recurring recipe, so that anyone who wants to have their site allow for managing recurring events, that's just a recipe that you apply, and now it's all sort of set up that way. It's updated the formatter for you, done a few things just to sort of make that process a little easier. In reality, if you knew what you were doing, making those changes probably could be done within 5 minutes, but that's a big if. And I think that's the spirit of what recipes are hoping to achieve, is to say, let's take things that previously required either a Drupal expert or a lot of times sort of clicking around or reading documentation to figure out, and make those simple for end users to, make those changes to their site. Some of the changes that have gone into sort of the ecosystem that the events recipes draws on more recently are things like in the Smart Date module, which just had a stable release of the 4.2 branch this morning. There is now an overlay for displaying the available durations. So in the same way that users are probably used to seeing in like Google Calendar or Apple Calendar, a similar sort of pattern. So when you sort of give focus to the end date, it shows a list of optional times as well as the duration next to those, as opposed to previously there was kind of like a separate duration. And some people said that they found that confusing. Again, had been for a long time sort of a one of the things that was different from common patterns in the space. But, at the time Smart Date was created, that was just sort of technically what was feasible to implement. And so that's the way it had been. But working on the events recipe for Drupal CMS kind of inspired me to try and go out and get that better aligned with sort of the mental models people are probably operating with when they use or manage events in Drupal.
Yeah.
And then the most recent change there was actually updating it so that if you're using like the Gin admin theme, that it'll use like dark mode. If you've got your site in dark mode, it'll use the highlight color that you've set, those kinds of things to really try and make it as seamless a part of the overall interface as possible. From the calendar standpoint, again, full calendar 3.0.0 is stable as of this morning. It's been a busy morning for me. There's been a lot of work there in terms of really sort of modernizing the code base. I mean, we were fortunate to inherit from previous maintainers a very feature-rich code base, but also something that hadn't really seen any significant development in, I think, over 4 years. So, Smart Date integration was obviously a focus there, but also lots of things around being able to accurately work with lots of different kinds of fields, being able to provide formatting options, like being able to color code how things will display based on either the content type or what taxonomy terms they've been assigned. And then more recently, things like making sure that if you have a time zone set for your site, that it will actually do the conversion of the events that are displayed so that they display in your time zone as opposed to the original time zone. So if you set an event in Chicago time zone, it'll actually in the calendar convert it so that you're seeing it properly reflected there. So, and then I think the other big one was also from a locale standpoint. So if you're viewing a calendar in Spanish, the buttons and so on will automatically be converted to Spanish and so on. So lots of different pieces, lots of, moving parts, but trying to sort of incrementally, piece by piece, make the overall experience of managing events within Drupal as easy as possible. And, certainly from a Drupal CMS standpoint, making that as robust an experience as we can out of the box.
Some would say, Martin, that you're doing God's work here, dealing with events and time zones, and now you're adding locality to it. I think anybody, probably all of us on this call, have at some point dealt with one of those things, but you're deciding to just throw them all together in a recipe. My question is the event recipe could you use it? Could you install it and get some of this or all of this functionality?
You apply recipes, you don't install recipes.
Thank you for the correction there. Yes, Nick is correct. You apply recipes, you do not install them.
So I think because of the path that I took to working on the events recipe in Drupal CMS, I've gone a little bit of a different approach than some of the other tracks. What I ended up doing was making them standalone projects first. So there is, if you go drupal.org/project/events, that's the events recipe. And then from there, I've got a version of that that's sort of set up to work specifically within Drupal CMS. So all of the pieces that I've been working on with the intent of them being capabilities that will be within Drupal CMS in some way or another at some point, I'm really starting in the contrib space to make it possible to get feedback on those even before Drupal CMS starts to get widespread, use and adoption.
Sorry, I have a relevant question, but before we get to that, was the events namespace just available?
So it kind of, it was an abandoned project. It was actually a distribution going back to, I think it was actually a Drupal 7 distribution, and there were like 4 sites that were using it. And so I basically applied for and got the namespace and took it over.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Um, First of all, I think everything that you've said so far is great. One of the there's certainly a lot of really cool things happening with Drupal CMS. Uh, but I think for me, one of the things that I've noticed had that I think is really refreshing is it's it's given the community the ability to look at using Drupal as an outsider and prioritizing how do you make it make sense and has provided a lot of energy there because I don't want to make it seem like people haven't been thinking about this for a long time because there's certainly a lot of people that spend a lot of time um, you know, doing research, posting issues, fixing that. But sometimes getting those fixes aligned with a developer and prioritizing it, I think has been difficult in the past for the Drupal community. And I think Drupal and CMS, I mean, there's so much. So, but we're talking about this right now. Drupal CMS has really given developers, I think, a fresh perspective and are really like just implementing a lot of these. Some of them I'm sure are difficult. Some of them probably were easier than expected, but just never were prioritized. And it's really nice to see all the little usability things that are just getting, well, I say little, but like having like the duration just in line, like it's just so much more convenient to be able to have there. But yeah, it's awesome.
So I think there's a few things that go into that. I mean, number one, I can't say enough good things about Lowry and the influence that he's had on the Drupal community and in sort of that product owner role. I don't know to what degree, he's had a true predecessor as somebody who's thinking about Drupal as a product and how that can be, easier to use, that experience of doing sometimes mundane things, but really just how can we sort of smooth out those rough edges and make it just more intuitive to use. The other thing that I noticed with Starshot is that there's a lot more development from people who are sort of less, um, contributors by profession, if you understand my meaning. So people who are on, day-to-day basis actually building websites for customers. And so I think they bring a slightly different perspective in terms of kind of, real world use cases that some of these things need to meet. And I think, I'm really encouraged by some of those changes that you're talking about that I think are really driven by, a heightened sense of what the people building and working in and creating content within websites need on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I have a question,
Go ahead.
follow-up question to something you just said. So you said that, this is bringing in more, more developers that are less, contributors. I failed to remember your exact terms, but, professional contributors, if you will, right? Do you think that is leading to more rapid development of these things because there are these people that are coming in are more like, here's the thing that does the thing that fixes the thing, as opposed to like it has to be the most perfect thing ever. It has to be like the best Drupal code ever written.
I think to some degree. I mean, I think it's a bit of a balancing act, to be honest. I mean, up until now, Drupal CMS has included to some degree core patches of just to say, to get this thing working the way that it should work. We don't mind if Drupal or if Drupal CMS includes patches to core to say, let's just get this working. And down the road at some point, we'll sort of try and smooth out, get the actual change committed to core and some of those other things. The impression I get is that they're trying to, as Drupal CMS matures towards a stable release, move away from that. And so there's a bit of that dynamic tension where some of the things may be upstream in terms of where the changes need to happen. And Drupal as a project does have, these, different gates and things meant to ensure the quality of that sort of core product. And so to the extent that Drupal CMS can be more sort of, agile and iterative in terms of making improvements, definitely, I would say that's true. But there are also places where, it hopefully will provide more impetus to some of the things that are more difficult and sometimes slower to get changed.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're gonna go on another small tangent here because Martin said another thing that I have a question about. So you just said that you're patching core, right, for Starshot. So is that kind of patching in the traditional sense where, like, when you install Starshot, the installer is going to download core and then it's going to apply all of these patches that you need for Starshot to actually run appropriately, or Drupal CMS to run appropriately? Is that the idea?
That's the idea. I would say at this particular moment in time, or at least the last time I installed Starshot locally, it was actually a bit of a different process than sort of, your sort of standard composer create project. So to what extent that becomes something that, even continues to be the case, like I have to imagine at some point there's more of an intention for Drupal CMS to be something that can be installed in that more traditional method, but I'm, like that's a little above my pay grade in terms of where all of that will end up.
I guess the root of my question was more like, is Starshot a separate code base at this point?
I mean, it's a project on Drupal.org. I'm not sure when you say separate code base,
okay,
exactly what you mean. I think it includes Drupal core.
Yeah. Okay. I got you.
Which is a little bit unique, but
Yeah.
they still have to
Okay.
figure that piece out. Now,
Got it.
I think something clicked for me too when you I think 2 tangents ago. Drupal 7, we had a saying, there's a module for that, right? And I think people still say that phrase in Drupal, but I don't think it's as true anymore. We have a lot of ecosystem modules, we have a lot of integration modules, we have a lot of like general functionality modules. But one of the things about Drupal 7 was any little minor thing that you needed to customize, there was a module for that you could install. I mean, that's why you had sites that had 150, 200 modules. You just had a suite of modules that you install for every site. Drupal 8, 9, 10, 11 now, a lot of those little customizations just kind of make their way into a custom module that you maintain for your clients. And a lot of those fixes are easier, right? They don't really warrant their own module because it's a 5-line thing that you just include in it. But one thing that is lost with that is there's no longer like that visibility. Like, what are the community wide hangups? What are the community wide things? And I think Starshot, or I think Drupal CMS, has done a great job of bringing those types of things out of the woodwork and giving people a way to be like, you know what, maybe we can get this solution. Like, this is something that all of our clients always need. This is our way to get it into, it's not core, but get it into core, right? We're going to cut a lot of that red tape. And then somebody else is like, oh, wait, we have the same issue. And that just makes it more likely. Or we have that same issue, but we solved it slightly this way. And so those types of little like paper cut issues are being discussed again in a way that hasn't happened in quite some time. And not only is it being discussed, those issues are just kind of being rolled in and solved for, which I think is going to help Drupal as a whole in general too, right? Because we have those solutions, we build them out for Starshot, and if we find a way to fix it in a generic way, that can just make it into core, and then everybody has that solution, right? So, but I hadn't thought about it that way. It's one of those things where, like, different agencies just had different I was about to say recipes, but not recipes. Their own solution for all the different usability quirks of Drupal, and they kind of just those lived in their own custom utility module that they just installed in every project. And now that information is being kind of given back to the community in a way that it hasn't happened in a few years. So that's encouraging to see as well.
I feel like I feel like that was more prevalent, at least in my experience with Drupal 6 and 7. Like you would always inherit a Drupal 7 site, right? And you would see like X company module, and you'd be like, well, what does this do? And you're like, oh, it does this and it does that and it does this other thing. And I think like, I mean, I still very much subscribe to there's a module for that philosophy, even in Drupal 9 and 10, right? Like there typically modules for everything. And, I often and I've probably said this on the show before, but I'll often ask developers when I'm in an interview, like interviewing them, like, okay, client comes to you with a problem, right? And you go to Drupal.org, and there's a module that does 80% of what it needs to. Do you take that module and use it and then code the 20%, or do you just build it from scratch because you know what you're going to get? And inevitably somebody will say, "Oh, I'll just build it myself because I'm going to, I know exactly what needs to be done." And in my opinion, that is the wrong answer, because it's a lot easier, better, faster in most cases to take that 80% of the work that's been done and use it and have the community, maintain it and so on, than to have to maintain it all yourself. But I don't know. I don't know that I mean, Nick, you might know better than I, because you're doing more direct client work, but I don't see a lot of people creating a lot of custom modules that they're not then saying, "Oh, I'm going to contribute this back because it solves a problem that I think other people have," right? Like, I don't see that like agency name module sitting in repos as much.
I mean,
Yeah.
I do. I think the older, like in Drupal 7, Drupal 6, I feel like those modules are more like, we need to do something to get these three modules to play nicely together. Then we're adding functionality. Whereas now it's more like, core doesn't quite do what we want, so we're going to change how it works. Or we just need this pre-process function on every single one. We need this, right? But anyway, the thing I'm excited about is the fact that I feel like those little paper cut issues are being talked about in a meaningful way. They're being solved in a
Yeah.
meaningful way. I think that's the thing that's exciting to me, is that it's been a while since
I think
those
we're
have been
saying the
talked about
same.
globally.
I
Yeah.
think we're saying the same thing from different angles, because I think, like, the way I look at it is, I think people are more empowered to contribute a module to the ecosystem, right? As opposed to, like, back in the day, they'd be like, either it'd be, this is for a client and I can't contribute it, or I don't feel comfortable, like, submitting this small fixed code to this big open source project. Josh, you
You
wanted
know,
to say something?
yeah, I was just thinking, maybe it shifts from there's an app for that to you can configure that. Because I think
Yeah.
that's what recipes are really kind of bubbling up for us, is that all of us do it a little bit different, but
Mhm.
when we're site building, it's mostly about naming things and hooking together the different configurations, which is kind of tedious work. It's not really what a true hardcore developer wants to do with their day to day. But now we can boilerplate a lot of that with a best practice, maybe tie it to a small helper module or an ecosystem module. Like events does so much work around, hey, this is what you should name all these things.
Yep.
That
Yeah.
that's huge, because a lot of junior developers really haven't got the hang of naming things in Drupal space yet, and they come up with horrible names that you're like, I want to refactor that, but I know how hard it is to refactor a name. So I think what Drupal CMS is giving us is better starting names for a sane configuration. And then maybe we don't even need the custom module, because we see, oh yeah, that can be done with core, or
I
that
think it
can be
go
done with core plus events.
Yeah, I think it goes one further though. Like, I harken back to configuring reoccurring events in Drupal 7 and the nightmare
Mm.
that it was, because you had like 50 entities that like you had to you were like, oh, if you change one, it mirrors it, but then if you check one that's not in, like, comes out of the pattern, then it's its own thing, and like, it's like
Yep.
Inception, right? So I think, like,
Recurrence is hard.
yeah,
Thank you,
right,
Martin.
right,
Thank
yeah,
you for
exactly.
tackling
Like,
recurrence.
Yeah.
what this provides is a novice Drupal user to say, I need events to install this recipe, and like, now I have recurring events. Now I have an interface that works. Now I have, like, you've solved all of those problems, and now I'm on to move, like, the next thing, right? So yeah, all in all, I guess that's my way of saying I'm really excited about recipes. I look forward to seeing it in Drupal CMS, and seeing people create more recipes in the future. All right, let's switch topics. We're going to start talking about WordPress. No, I'm kidding. We're not going to start talking about WordPress. We're actually going to talk about Drupal tooling for core development. Nick, tell us all about tooling for core development.
Yeah, so I just want to chat about this a little bit because I've been doing more core development recently, and I've realized that there's a whole lot of stuff happening that if you don't do core development, you're probably not aware of. So I thought it might be interesting to chat about. So, and there's a couple of things that I learned um, to maybe make your lives easier. So one of the first things is, and we Drupal has a PHP stand rule set that they use to kind of try to keep at least new code up to par and kind of catch things like an unused variable, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of core, and so a lot of old code doesn't quite meet the rules yet. And there's something called a baseline, which is basically like, hey, these are all the errors that we know about, and you can ignore them for now. And there's a few initiatives to kind of go through and clean those up as as things move forward, and people are making good progress on that. But it's something to kind of keep in mind. I had I've been working on a project to like explore what it would look like to convert core to use the new object-oriented hooks, and part of that requires moving a lot of code around, so it required generating baselines. And I'm happy to say that that was actually helpful today because there was an an issue that got merged that caused baselines to fail. And because I've had to do it so much recently, I had a script written. So I think I'm going to release that for some people to see, because it's one of those things where if you try to run the baseline with the existing baseline, it takes a lot of memory and a lot of processing power. But with a couple of tricks that I learned, it does it a lot quicker. It takes like the first time I ran it on my laptop, it took like 45 minutes and crashed everything. But with some of the tips that I learned, I mean, I was on my laptop this morning, but the one I ran took about 4 minutes. So,
Sorry,
um,
for a non-developer, when you say baseline, you just mean like a base configuration, like a starting
no,
point.
no, well, sort of. So the baseline in this case is explicitly like it essentially scans. Okay, so let me take a step back. So what PHP stand does is it will scan a file and be like, is there a return type on this function? Right? And if there's no return type on the function or the method, it'll throw an error and say, hey, you need to add a return type for this method. Like I said, there's a lot of core and a lot of old code. So there's a lot of methods and functions that don't have return types. So the
Yeah.
baseline is this function in this file has this error. Ignore it if you see it.
Hmm.
There are currently, I think, 12,000 errors in Drupal core for things like that all get ignored. And so and like I said, there's some initiatives to clean some of that up. But like I said, it's something that if you don't do core development, you might not know about it. But it's something that people have put a lot of thought into. And like, we want new code and core to meet these standards, but we also can't just institute that standard globally because, as I said, there's 12,000 errors. Like that would take months and months and months to clean up. In
Right.
fact, it's been going on for a long time. But it's one of the tools that core uses to make sure that new code going forward is up to snuff. And then slowly people have been going back and fixing stuff in the backlog.
So like baseline is like an allowable error list,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. Like a list of
Well,
errors
it's
that we
mostly
already know about.
warnings, right? It's not that
Yeah.
many actual like full-on errors. It's just like, hey, this is deprecated, or hey, you should really format this way. It's not something that's because I think it's important to call out. It's not a stability issue to have all those
Yeah.
in there. It's a
It's not
hey,
detrimental.
yeah, it's not affecting our progress. Let's ignore it for now, and we'll come back and clean it up. Nick,
Yeah,
when
that's the way
you
to put it.
see one of those pop up in a particular file that you're working on, though, um, should it be addressed in like the micro, like the small? Oh,
Yeah.
hey, I should go ahead and clean this up, even if it's included in the baseline. It's okay to ignore, and then maybe remove that baseline for that file, or is it a different process?
So in general, for most things in core, they're pretty strict about not just like doing random changes unrelated, right? So if you're working in a file that has some methods that don't have return types, right? the practice isn't to be like, well, I'm working on this anyway, let me just add return types, right? Which you might do on a client project. There's generally going to be a dedicated meta, like for example, there's a couple that have been merged recently getting ready for 11.1, right? Like they added return types for all hook module and install implementations in core. There's one they're working on right now to get all hook form alters. So they generally work on those as a class so that we can make sure that it's consistent. We know that error should never show up again. There are some exceptions especially with code sniffing. One thing that I found recently with code sniffing is that there's two, and code sniffing is rather than looking for like variables that are unused or might not exist or that kind of thing. Code sniffing is more about like, hey, you should have two spaces here. You should have a space before the end, after the end of a function. Those types of rules. I found that first of all, the code sniffing job that runs in GitLab isn't a full rule set. And second, I think there's so many code sniffing errors in core that it sometimes just flat out fail. Like it doesn't fail, but it fails silently. So occasionally you'll edit a file, and for some reason that file wasn't particularly inspected before, and it will detect some things that if there weren't so many other issues, it would have detected initially. And so I have had issues where you edit a file, now it's detecting a bunch of code sniff errors, and you have to fix those. And those ones you kind of have to. You can't. There's no way around it. But in general, it's more about making sure new code is written correctly, and then old code, people are kind of going through and kind of backfilling those. Um, but like I said, it's just one of those things that kind of exists until you really interact with it. You don't really pay attention to it too much, other than you might interact on an issue and then it fails and you have to figure out what's going on. But when you're doing more, you kind of understand the why behind it. The other thing is DDEV, and this is a shout out for DDEV. DDEV makes it fairly easy to run unit tests, but until recently, I never had to run functional JavaScript tests in Drupal, and it took me. I'll link to what I finally found out on how to get it to work. It took me quite some time to get those working, but then I found that there's an add-on for DDEV that just worked. Once I found it and I installed it, you could run those tests. They're still a lot more difficult to debug than some other unit tests or kernel tests, but if you can't run them locally, it's very, very difficult to debug. But yeah, DDEV is great for running all these tools. It makes it a lot easier to kind of switch between environments and run these tools.
So yeah, DDEV is great. Sorry, I was just thinking about how easy DDEV makes things, like just in local development. And Martin is shaking his head in agreement, for those of you that can't see, but like
Nodding my head.
yeah. So I didn't I just say that? What did I say?
Shaking.
Which is typically
Something.
no.
Oh, not nodding. Yes, shaking. Got it. Okay, cool. Remind me to tell you about a funny conversation about milkshakes I had yesterday, and the fact that I just yesterday learned what a milkshake actually is.
Wait, we can't leave that hanging.
That's an interesting one to just kind of like leave out there like that.
Yeah. What?
All right, fine. So I guess in my brain, I had never really thought that let me back up. Yesterday, we went to get ice cream with the kids, and I got a frap, which a frap is typically just like blended ice cream, right? In like in a cup, right? Well, then I started thinking like, okay, what's the difference between a frap and a milkshake? And my wife goes, well, they add milk to the milkshake, and I kind of was like it literally made my brain hurt because I had never actually thought of like a milkshake as ice cream and milk like shaken up, right?
I mean, it would be more accurate to call it a milk blend, but
Sure, maybe, but like in my head, I was just like, oh, a milkshake is just ice cream blended up, and like didn't really give it much thought. And yesterday it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks.
Okay, so you knew what a milkshake was. You just didn't realize that a milkshake had
Yeah,
milk. Okay.
I just kind of like was like didn't really like
That
I
makes
didn't
a lot more
parse the
sense.
term milkshake
Yeah.
to be in my head. It was ice cream shake,
No, no.
right? And
I thought you were implying that you had never heard of a milkshake before. That's what
oh no, that would be silly. And in Rhode Island, I don't know if this is just a Rhode Island thing or maybe it's a New England thing. They also have cabinets, which is like a whole nother
wait, I
subset.
have no idea what that is.
Yeah. A cabinet and a frap, I believe, are the same thing.
Okay. Never heard of a
So
cabinet. Well,
look
I've
that
heard of
up.
cabinets on the wall, but I've never heard of cabinet in reference to a milkshake. But yeah,
Um,
continue.
anyway, going back to DDev, DDev is great. And I made a switch to it quite a few months ago for local development. It's just so easy, and there are so many great commands, and it gets updated frequently and all sorts of new stuff. I am just going to throw this into the show. If you have not gone and supported Randy and the DDev community, and you use DDev, you should do that because they're definitely doing great work over there to make all of our lives a lot easier. Okay. Before we close this show, there's one more topic in this list that I wanna jump into, and it's not about food. So brace yourself. Martin, you have something here called the Open University Initiative, and I was just curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, I forget where I heard about it the first time. I think it maybe was in the event organizers channel. But there is a group largely based in Europe that are in the process of trying to create essentially an open source curriculum for universities to teach Drupal. So I'm sure lots of people are aware that higher education is a space where Drupal is seeing a lot of adoption in terms of being the sort of, online face of universities. But this is really about saying, let's have an open source curriculum so that universities that want to teach Drupal don't have to sort of individually do all of the work of updating those when, Drupal 12 comes out or, those kinds of things, so that can be a community effort. And then, I was even talking to one of the folks at Reykjavik University about, like one of the things they like to do is have students work on a project at the end of their schooling. And so, could Drupal event platform be a student project? Because there is some significant work that needs to be done there around, moving it all to recipes, having some of the functional elements that today are part of the Drupal event platform, moving those into separate configurable projects so that the recipes that the event platform will become can just configure those to work in the same way they do today. But then those functional bits can have other uses for other projects and so on. So I think it's a super interesting space. I have long advocated that it would be amazing if more of the universities that use Drupal could also teach Drupal. Like I feel like they could have a cheap pool of labor. And then it also means that we have people who, when they graduate, hopefully go out into the community as advocates for Drupal in the, the jobs that they eventually, start working.
So two great thoughts on that. One, I can't remember who delivered this talk, but I can't remember if it was a camp or a group talk. But I remember attending a talk that that similarly to what you're talking about was talking about developing your talent pool and your talent pipeline for recruitment. And this company was actually working with a university, I think in Canada, maybe. What?
So the reason that I sort of chuckled when you said that is I'm pretty sure you're talking about Yan Zhang of Digital Echidna, which is where I used to work. I used to work with Yan, and I was actually one of the people that would teach to students at Fanshawe College, which is sort of, one of the larger sort of community colleges in Canada, has some, very technical programs around sort of web development and so on. So, I'm deeply familiar with the program. And actually the last Open University Initiative meeting I was at, I got Yan to hop on the call because of all of the work that they've been doing teaching Drupal already. And I thought they would be, great to sort of plug into all of that as well.
So Yes, that is actually what I am talking about. And I just thought it was an amazing idea because it's like, it's really a no brainer to say like, hey, if we teach kids Drupal and then we say, hey, we have an open position, like they can not necessarily walk right into it, but like there's a pathway from education to career, right? Which is a huge problem in education, I think, these days. The other thing I wanted to touch on was, and this is probably, oh geez, I don't know. Let's see, 10 years ago now. We'll go with, my alma mater. I came back and taught as an adjunct professor there, and one of the things they wanted me to teach was like building websites with a CMS. And so one trimester, I actually taught Drupal, and um, it was both very educational for me as to learning how to teach Drupal to folks that weren't, web developers. But it was also very interesting to see like how they interacted with it. And I think that's like super important. Like I think like getting Drupal into more university settings and having more classes on Drupal specific or maybe just CMS specific is super important. I think that's another area where like you think of or at least I think of Drupal CMS as like a potential competitor to some of these like SaaS CMS platforms, right? Like I think that's another area where like kids are learning early that they can go to Squarespace and spin up a site in like 10 minutes, right? They could do that with Drupal CMS and recipes and the stuff that we're building now, right? It'd be great to get into educational settings and be able to get that into the hands of the youth. I think that's a great initiative. I'm glad that you brought it up, and if I can be helpful, you feel free to reach out and let me know. All right.
We get to try to get a new generation of PHP developers, because I think building websites with a CMS is one thing, but that's almost, I almost see that like as like an emerging media, digital arts, communications degree sort of opportunity. But if we could get more universities to say, hey, we normally start all of our computer science courses in Python, because Python is a really good language for teaching the fundamentals of programming. If we could get a few more of them to do some PHP based, really kind of thinking of it from even that deeper level so that we could kind of grow that crop of Drupal users as well. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like yes, yes to that, but I don't know that it has to be a holistic change, right? I feel like it could be either a course selection or an elective selection where you could say, hey, intro to PHP, and then you could say like intro to PHP based CMSs with Drupal and maybe WordPress, who knows. Like I think there's definitely pathways to that, but I think like the other thing that's interesting to me is like we could definitely focus a lot on both the code and non-code side of Drupal, right? Because like, yeah, you could walk into a computer science school and say, hey, here's Drupal, we need help building it. But then there's also that marketing and site building and content architecture and like side of it that like lends itself to so many other verticals.
Get them both. Yeah.
Get them all. Everybody should use Drupal. Drupal's great.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
Listeners, have you ever thought, man, I really wish I could be like Mike Anello? If so, you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal, just like Mike did today. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that big Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Okay, Martin, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, talk about event recipes or event platform or smart dates or any of the million things you got going on, how could they go about doing that?
Folks can find me as Manclue on all of the Drupal and social platforms. They can also read my blogs at manclue.com. And if they want to really geek out on event stuff, there is the Date Time channel of Drupal Slack where I am frequently found.
Josh, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, elicit your consulting services, or just talk about stuff, how could they go about doing that?
Yeah, reach out to me on Drupal.org. I'm Joshua Wami, also on Drupal Slack, or at my website, joshuawami.com.
Awesome. Nick Laughlin, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, Nicxvan.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone.